Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown is so much more than a Metroidvania. It's so many different genres all wrapped up in a Metroidvania package, and today I'd like to break down each of those separate genres and discuss how it all ties back into the Metroidvania structure. In this day and age, you can't just make a game in a particular genre and expect success. You'll just be labelled as generic and become quickly forgotten about. You always need some kind of spin or hook. Ironically, Ubisoft is the prime offender of bland games being churned out to fill a niche without creative or a passionate hook behind their releases. This is the company that thinks releasing a classic-style Assassin's Creed counts as innovation. So, of all publishers to put out a fresh and feature-rich Metroidvania, I never expected it to be them. However, I'll admit I never expected to see another AAA Metroidvania without Metroid in the title, as indie games have come along and perfected the genre. This is no more apparent than in Hollow Knight, who mastered the core of Metroidvania. No fancy bells and whistles, this is pure, undistilled, unrivaled Metroidvania magic. That's not a knock against the game, it certainly didn't need an intricate combat system or engaging story, but I may be suggesting that it was forgiven for not having those things because it's held to a different standard as an indie game. I mean, should games really be judged based on their budgets, or should they be judged on the quality of their experiences? Despite that, let's take a look at all the shiny bells and whistles a AAA Metroidvania can afford. The first genre that The Lost Crown evolves from is a hack-and-slash side-scroller. I don't think I've ever seen combat this in-depth in a non-combat focused 2D game. While Hollow Knight and Ori got away with only having one basic attack and a bunch of special moves to add on top, The Lost Crown has combos and directional input, which gives players options and makes combat feel more satisfying. The environment also plays a prominent role in combat encounters. Since the game has such extreme knockback for both you and your enemies, positioning and placement matter much more in The Lost Crown than in other genre contemporaries. This is wild to me. The environment and its hazards are such a big part of the genre as a whole, so it's unbelievable to me that more developers don't put two and two together and give more opportunities for enemies to be defeated by the environment. A key feature of hack-and-slash titles is that the battles can't be over quickly. The Lost Crown shows this by having super beefy enemies with sizable health pools designed to be chipped away at. This is where the combat's greatest strength comes into play. It's speed. These enemies hit you a lot harder than you hit them, but they have discernible tells and are much slower than you. Sargon's speed is his greatest ally, and combo animations are timed perfectly to fit in between the lumbering enemy attacks, making for hit-and-weave combat that shines when combined with a breakneck pace. However, when having to engage multiple enemies at once, that intense flow state gets broken pretty quickly, as the 2D plane doesn't provide as many locations for dodging as three-dimensional games do. This means that the combat is at its peak during boss fights, and if you're interested, I have a video out where I rank all of the Lost Crown's boss fights, so I won't reiterate what I said in that video here. The other genre that The Lost Crown nails is 2D platforming. Now, I know what you're thinking. Metroidvanias are already 2D platformers. This isn't something special. And that's fair, only if you can look me in the eye and tell me that Metroid, Symphony of the Night, and Hollow Knight are all platformers in the way that Celeste, Mario Wonder, and Donkey Kong Country are. So I don't think of Metroidvanias as 2D platformers. It's more like 2D open-world games that focus on backtracking and character upgrades. The Lost Crown is definitely a platformer in the same vein as those games, as it's constantly introducing new environmental interactives to create platforming challenges in the same way that Rayman Legends did. Using things like monkey bars, bell platforms, sand streams, and grapple points, the game evolves by introducing more and more challenging mechanics for the player to overcome, just as a regular 2D platformer would. Most Metroidvanias have combat and enemies as the primary challenge, and since many Metroidvanias don't offer difficulty selection for some reason, they often become the roadblocks. But The Lost Crown does have adjustable difficulty. While I don't believe in this stupid macho stuff about only playing games on the hardest difficulty and never turning it down if it frustrates you, there is no way I'm going to skip over a challenge like The Lost Crown lets you do. The platforming segments are inventive and rewarding thanks to the abilities you gain being used in unique ways, with the shining star being the ability that lets you teleport your character to a previous spot you were standing in. And it occurs to me now that none of the powers you gain throughout your journey are particularly time-focused, and they seem to have a lot more in common with the concept of space rather than time. The Lost Crown is what it looks like when a genre defined by indie titles for the last decade gets a big budget and creative, passionate team behind it. In doing so, they made a Metroidvania with more in-depth mechanics than the genre has seen for quite some time, having more open-ended combat and challenging traversal trials. The Lost Crown is what a AAA game looks like when it takes lessons from indie titles.